Washington froze. In the middle of a heated political debate, Jasmine Crockett slid a folder across the table and hinted at a secret so explosive it could shatter Donald Trump's carefully built empire. The room went silent, but when the cameras caught the first page, the question became, how much longer can the truth stay sealed? Before we get to this explosive moment, tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe truth still matters, hit subscribe. We've got another jaw-dropping story coming tomorrow. The hum of side conversations echoed through the cavernous hearing room. It was late in the day, and half the seats in the House Oversight Committee chambers sat empty. Paper rustled, phones glowed, and even the chairman looked distracted. That was when Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett slowly removed her glasses and set them on the desk in front of her. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I'm asking for silence," she began, her gaze moving deliberately from the dais to the scattered audience. Not from this room, but from the noise of tradition. The words landed with an uneasy weight. The few still paying attention straightened in their chairs. Her tone was low, measured but sharp enough to cut through the dull atmosphere. She leaned forward. In 2019, in Arizona, there were sealed court documents involving Donald Trump, a former staffer, and a child. Murmurs began to ripple. Those documents remain sealed, but I have here a sworn affidavit from a federal contractor tasked with digitally shredding files flagged for deletion. One file was different. She held up a page from a thick folder. A $3.1 million payment to... The room froze. Even the air seemed to stop moving. The committee members, the aides, the few journalists left in the gallery, everyone locked their eyes on her. At home, viewers sat forward. The implication was clear, even if she hadn't said the name. A pair of Trump allies on the panel sprang into action. One shouted over her, calling it despicable. Another demanded the chair strike her words from the record. Crockett didn't flinch. "We're not talking gossip," she replied evenly, her voice still calm but impossible to ignore. "We're talking justice." The protest grew louder. A swirl of procedural objections and moral outrage. The chairman's gavel cracked against the block, but the chaos only deepened. Someone leaned over to whisper frantically to a staffer near the back. Then, without warning, the live broadcast feed cut. For viewers at home, the screen went black for several minutes before returning to unrelated coverage. In that silence, speculation began to spread like wild online, in newsrooms, in text threads across the country. And in that moment, Crockett knew she had already changed the conversation. Before she ever sat under the blinding lights of a nationally televised hearing, Jasmine Crockett was a civil rights attorney in Dallas, walking into courtrooms where the odds were stacked against her clients. She built her reputation on a stubborn refusal to accept the "that's just how it's done" shrug that often accompanied injustice. Where others saw a wall, she saw a case file waiting to be opened. Her early career was defined by meticulous preparation. She never arrived without a binder thick enough to rattle when she set it down on counsel's table. Every page was tabbed, highlighted, and cross-referenced. Judges knew her as the attorney who would wait patiently for an opponent to make a false claim and then, without raising her voice, produce the document that unraveled their argument. She didn't believe in theatrics for their own sake. She believed in evidence, cold, written, verifiable evidence. When she ran for Congress, some said her style wouldn't translate to the theater of politics. But Crockett saw politics as another courtroom, one where the jury was the American public. Her campaign speeches weren't heavy on soaring rhetoric. They were tight, factual, and anchored in receipts. She spoke about housing discrimination with property records in her hand. She addressed police misconduct with internal memos that had never been seen outside legal discovery. By the time she arrived in Washington, she was already known for one thing: turning documentation into a political weapon. Allies admired her for it. Opponents feared it. She didn't bluff. If Crockett hinted she had something in writing, she did, and she wouldn't show her hand until she was certain the moment would land. Her philosophy was simple. Personal conduct mattered when it intersected with public service. She didn't care about gossip. She cared about patterns of behavior that eroded trust, that betrayed voters, that bent the rules of governance into something unrecognizable. She rarely broke script in a hearing, but when she did, it was deliberate, calculated, and aimed with the precision of a scalpel. Those who had worked alongside her in the legal trenches knew the signs: the slight pause before she spoke, the quiet removal of her glasses, the way her fingers rested on a folder as if it were an anchor. When those tells appeared, something was coming, and it was never good news for whoever sat in the crosshairs. The events in the Oversight Committee that day were not an accident. They were the product of weeks, maybe months, of preparation. Crockett had studied the terrain, waited for the right witness, the right question, the right lull in attention to strike. For her, the silence she demanded was not just for dramatic effect. It was to clear the air before she detonated a truth that could not be walked back. Donald Trump's life in public view had always been a mix of spectacle and careful curation. As a businessman, celebrity, and eventually president, he understood the value of a brand, and his brand was built on loyalty, dominance, and control. Supporters saw him as a fighter who never backed down. Detractors saw a man who treated every challenge as a personal attack. His time in the White House was marked by an unyielding defense of that image. Scandals came and went, but Trump maintained a core strategy: never admit, never apologize, and always redirect. Behind the scenes, legal teams worked to contain threats before they reached public view. Sealed settlements, non-disclosure agreements, and aggressive litigation were tools of the trade. Sensitive personal matters were managed with the same discipline as corporate negotiations: quietly, swiftly, and with legal muscle. Family was central to his political identity. The image of the Trump family, photogenic, loyal, united, was a constant fixture in campaign materials and public appearances. Any suggestion that fractured that image was treated as both a personal insult and a political threat. The notion of a perfect family wasn't just a sentimental ideal, it was a pillar of his political capital. This was why the mention of paternity disputes carried such volatility. To most voters, it was an irrelevant personal matter. To Trump, it was a potential crack in the foundation of the brand he had cultivated for decades. Those who had followed his career closely knew whispers of such disputes weren't new. In the pre-presidency years, there had been rumors, muted, often dismissed, about settlements and gag orders tied to questions of parentage. They never stuck in the public consciousness because they never escaped the legal net cast around them. When he was cornered, Trump's instinct was to lash out. He had no interest in conceding ground or letting an accusation hang unanswered. Whether in business, politics, or personal life, his approach was to attack the accuser, discredit the evidence, and flood the narrative with counterclaims until the original charge was buried in noise. Those who had worked near him during his presidency recalled moments when certain topics could change his demeanor instantly. Financial transparency, business entanglements, and family questions, especially those tied to timelines overlapping his presidency, were landmines. Advisors learned to steer clear of them unless absolutely necessary. It was this history that made Crockett's move so dangerous. She wasn't speculating. She was pointing to documented transactions, sworn statements, and sealed records. For Trump, it wasn't just about disproving her. It was about stopping the spread of an idea that could weaken both his personal standing and his political clout. In the days before the hearing, allies might have sensed the danger. They had seen her in committee before, methodical and unshaken. But the belief that she wouldn't cross certain lines, especially those involving family, was part of what left them unprepared. Crockett, however, did not see it as crossing a line. To her, the line had already been crossed when public office and personal protection became intertwined in a way that threatened accountability. The hearing room was the stage, but the battle was for something larger: control of the narrative. Crockett came armed with documents. Trump came armed with his brand. Both understood that in politics, perception could matter more than proof, at least in the short term. But while Trump played for immediate dominance, Crockett played for the enduring weight of the record. The collision of those two strategies was inevitable, and when it happened, the impact would not just be measured in headlines, but in the lasting shift it created in how the public viewed the boundary between personal life and public power. The hearing had been meandering through predictable territory: ethics, oversight, and the kind of scripted exchanges that left viewers at home half asleep. A fellow committee member lobbed a softball question toward Jasmine Crockett, clearly expecting her to repeat the usual talking points. Instead, she leaned forward, eyes steady on the witness table where Donald Trump Jr. sat with a faint smirk. "Mr. Trump," she began, voice calm but edged with purpose, "ethics in public service aren't just about avoiding conflicts of interest. They're about ensuring that public resources aren't used for private protection. Do you agree?" Trump Jr. shrugged, leaning back in his chair. "Of course. But I think what we've seen for years now is a lot of witch hunts dressed up as oversight." His tone dripped with dismissal. Crockett didn't blink. "That's interesting," she said, flipping a page in the folder before her, "because I'm curious how you would classify the use of diplomatic travel schedules, White House security details, and government transportation to shield family members from legal exposure in unrelated personal matters." The air shifted. A few heads turned toward the dais. Trump Jr.'s smirk faltered slightly, replaced by a measured chuckle. "That's absurd. You're trying to connect dots that don't exist." Across the room, a couple of Trump-aligned members scoffed audibly. One leaned toward his microphone. "Madam Chair, this line of questioning is ridiculous." Crockett's tone never rose. "What's ridiculous," she said evenly, "is pretending there's no pattern when the paper trail says otherwise." She closed the folder without looking down at it, letting the gesture hang in the air. Trump Jr. crossed his arms. "Look, Congresswoman, if you're going to accuse me of something, at least have the decency to say it outright." She tilted her head. "I will, but I prefer to do it with evidence." The words landed like a slow drop of ink in water, spreading outward in silence. Even the scoffing quieted. Trump's surrogate still tried to brush it off with murmured asides and half-smiles, but there was an undeniable shift. The calmness in her voice, the unhurried way she approached the exchange, it wasn't the bluster they were used to facing. It was surgical. Trump Jr. tapped his pen against the table, the rhythm betraying a flicker of impatience. Crockett let the pause stretch, her gaze fixed on him as if measuring the exact moment to press further. When she finally spoke again, her voice was almost gentle. "I'm going to ask you once more. Do you agree that using the machinery of public office to protect a family member's private legal vulnerabilities is an abuse of power?" The question hung there, heavier than the gavel resting on the chair's desk. Crockett opened the folder with deliberate care, pulling out a sheet covered in printed itineraries. "This," she said, "is a schedule from March 2019. It matches your father's official trip to Phoenix. According to hotel records," she tapped another page, "you were booked at the same property, under an alias, in a suite adjoining a conference room reserved under the name of a former staffer mentioned in the sealed Arizona filings." Trump Jr. leaned toward his microphone. "Complete coincidence. I travel all the time. You're fishing." "Fishing," Crockett replied, "usually involves uncertainty. I'm reading from documentation." She slid the itinerary aside and replaced it with an email printout. "This is from an assistant to your father's chief of staff, instructing Secret Service to extend their protective perimeter to include the conference room in question for the duration of your stay." A Trump ally cut in. "This is nothing but an attempt to smear a private citizen for political gain." Crockett didn't turn toward the interruption. "What's disgusting," she said, locking eyes with Trump Jr., "is the breach of public trust. Security resources paid for by taxpayers were deployed to manage a private meeting directly linked to a legal dispute you have yet to acknowledge exists." Trump Jr. shifted in his seat. "You're reading into something that isn't there." Without acknowledging his protest, she pulled another sheet from the folder. "Property transaction records from 2 weeks after that meeting. A Phoenix condo purchased by an LLC registered in Delaware, traced through financial disclosures to a trust bearing your initials. Purchase price, $3.1 million. The same amount flagged in the affidavit tied to the sealed case." Gasps rippled through the gallery. One of the Trump-aligned members called for order, but the gavel fell late and without conviction. Crockett's voice remained steady. This is not about personal lives. This is about a pattern of using public office as a shield for private transactions that bear the hallmarks of legal avoidance. Trump Jr. leaned forward now, hands clasped. You have no idea what you're talking about. You're piecing together unrelated events to create some fantasy headline. Crockett slid the documents back into the folder, but left it open on the table. If this is fantasy, then it should be easy for you to point out exactly which part is untrue. His mouth opened, but no words came immediately. That hesitation was enough to change the temperature of the room. Even some of his allies shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Crockett reached for the top sheet again. I'll stop reading, she said, her eyes never leaving his, when you tell me which part is untrue. The room went still. Cameras zoomed in on Trump Jr.'s face. His usual reflex, to talk over, to redirect, met an unexpected wall of silence. Crockett wasn't filling the space with arguments. She was letting the weight of the words and the documents. Seconds passed. The chairman glanced between them, waiting for one to break. Finally, Trump Jr. leaned back in his chair, his tone turning sharp. This is a disgrace. You're bringing up sealed records and hearsay to score political points. You should be ashamed. Crockett didn't flinch. The truth doesn't need my volume, she said, her voice even, deliberate. It speaks for itself. The line landed with a quiet finality. Even those trying to defend him sensed the imbalance. Her restraint against his escalating agitation. He tried again. You're making baseless accusations about my family. She shook her head slightly. I'm presenting documented events. If you can point to a single false statement, the record will reflect it. Will you do that now? He stared at her, jaw set, but offered no correction. The absence of a denial echoed louder than any rebuttal. Around the room, the atmosphere had shifted from partisan performance to something sharper, heavier. Members who had been ready to leap to his defense seemed to reconsider, sensing that each objection risked amplifying the details already on the record. Crockett slid the folder toward the clerk. For the committee's record, she said, these documents will be entered in full. Trump Jr. muttered something under his breath, but the microphones didn't catch it. His posture betrayed irritation. Arms crossed, chin tucked, but he didn't try to reclaim the narrative. The chairman cleared his throat, attempting to move to the next questioner. But the exchange had already imprinted itself on everyone present. In the gallery, reporters' fingers flew across keyboards. In control rooms, producers marked the clip for immediate replay. Crockett gathered her notes, her expression unchanged. She didn't need to gloat, didn't need to push further. The silence she commanded at the start had returned, but now it was thick with consequence. As the gavel signaled the next round of questions, the sound barely registered. The confrontation had already set its hook. Outside the hearing room, it was only a matter of time before the footage began its second life. On phones, on news feeds, in conversations that would stretch far beyond these walls. The clip left the hearing room before Donald Trump Jr. even had a chance to collect himself. A junior producer from a major cable network sitting in the press gallery had already clipped the exchange, added a headline, and sent it to the newsroom. By the time Crockett walked out of the building, the moment had begun to metastasize across social media. On TikTok, the most viral version was raw, unpolished, and brutal in its simplicity. The caption, in bold white letters across the bottom, read, "Did she just say Barron's not his son?" The audio caught Crockett's calm voice asking, "Tell me which part is untrue," followed by a close-up of Trump Jr., first expression. Within an hour, it had crossed 1 million views. By the end of the day, it was at 8 million. Twitter, still the battleground for political discourse, erupted with hashtags, "Tell me which part," "No DNA," and "Paternity Gate," trended simultaneously. The speed was so fast that it forced newsroom editors to abandon their planned coverage for the evening. Major broadcast networks cut into their primetime programming to replay the moment, complete with slow-motion breakdowns and on-screen annotations. Cable news panelists picked sides. One conservative commentator called it an outrageous and unsubstantiated smear, while a liberal analyst countered, "That wasn't a smear. That was a controlled demolition of a public figure's credibility using receipts." The footage looped endlessly in split screen, with hosts debating whether Crockett had crossed a line or simply pulled back a curtain the public was never supposed to see. From political junkie shows to pop culture commentary, recorded emergency episodes. One progressive host noted, "The brilliance wasn't just in what she said, but in what she didn't say. She let the silence hang there, and in that silence people connected the dots themselves." A conservative podcaster, audibly agitated, accused Crockett of weaponizing sealed court records to score political points. Even late-night comedy shows joined in. One host opened with, "Usually when a politician says, 'I have the receipts, it's just a figure of speech,' Crockett actually had the receipts, and a folder thick enough to choke an elephant." The audience roared. Another played a game segment where guests had to guess whether a list of outrageous political headlines were real or fake. Crockett's confrontation with Trump Jr. was of course real. By the 48-hour mark, the clip was everywhere. Morning news roundtables, Instagram reels, reaction videos on YouTube. Political strategists privately admitted that the imagery of Trump Jr. being unable to refute the documents was more damaging than any shouted accusation. The moment had become a self-contained piece of political theater, needing no context to be understood. It was the kind of footage that could play in 30-second ads, in campaign emails, in political history documentaries years later. The real detonation wasn't just the allegation itself. It was how efficiently the media machine magnified it, embedding the question in millions of minds before anyone could mount a coordinated defense. Once that question took hold, it was no longer about Crockett's accusation. It was about whether Trump Jr. had failed in that critical moment to prove her wrong. In the days that followed, the country seemed to divide into two loud, unyielding camps. In cafeterias, barbershops, church parking lots, and union break rooms, the confrontation became the conversation. People didn't just discuss it, they dissected it, replayed it on phones, argued over every word and pause. For Crockett's supporters, the moment was the definition of courage. They pointed out that she had not shouted, had not relied on vague accusations, but had presented documents and challenged the other side to dispute them. In their eyes, that was accountability at its purest. If he could prove her wrong, one woman told a local news crew outside a grocery store, he would have done it right there. He didn't. That says everything. For Trump's loyalists, the exchange was an unforgivable attack, not just on him, but on his family. To them, it was character assassination wrapped in legalese. They dismissed the documents as misleading, the timing as politically motivated. "This isn't oversight," one man said in a diner interview. "This is a hit job." Among independents, however, something unprecedented happened. A flash poll conducted by a major research firm showed that belief in the core of Crockett's claim, the idea that there was truth in her implication, was higher than in any previous allegation leveled at the Trump family. 46% of independents surveyed said they found Crockett's presentation credible. That number sent shivers through political operatives on both sides. Cable news amplified the divide. In one segment, a conservative host brought on a legal analyst to question the ethics of referencing sealed documents. On another network, a progressive host invited a former prosecutor to explain how public interest can override confidentiality when misconduct is suspected. The result wasn't clarity. It was more fuel for an already raging debate. In living rooms, the split was personal. Families argued over dinner. Friends found themselves avoiding the topic to preserve the peace. On college campuses, students hosted impromptu town hall discussions about truth, privacy, and the limits of political discourse. At one such gathering, a student observed, "Whether she was right or wrong legally, she's changed the conversation. We're talking about power, privilege, and what the public has a right to know." Some saw the moment as a cautionary tale about public figures underestimating opponents. Others saw it as a turning point. A rare instance where a well-prepared lawmaker could pierce the armor of a political dynasty without resorting to theatrics. But no matter the perspective, one fact was undeniable. The confrontation had escaped the confines of political news and entered the bloodstream of popular culture. It was quoted in memes, referenced in unlighted online arguments, and even printed on protest signs in cities that had nothing to do with the original hearing. The split wasn't just political, it was cultural, and as the divide deepened, it became clear that the ripple effects would reach far beyond the next news cycle. Inside the White House, panic was palpable. While official spokespeople stuck to scripted denials, leaks from staff painted a different picture. Several aides reportedly warned senior advisors that the public perception damage might be irreversible. "It's not the allegation, it's that he didn't swat it down," one staffer was quoted as saying to a reporter off the record. By midweek, an audio recording surfaced, allegedly from a conversation between Trump's personal attorney and another legal advisor. In it, the lawyer could be heard saying, "We dodged that DNA order back then, and we need to make sure it stays buried." Though the attorney's team immediately claimed the clip was selectively edited, the damage was done. The phrase, "dodged the DNA order," began trending within hours. Legal analysts began speculating on whether Crockett's public reference to sealed records could prompt a judicial review. The chatter reached Arizona, where a judge who had presided over the 2019 case issued a rare public statement. "While I am bound by the constraints of the court sealing order, I have been following the public discussion with interest." Observers read between the lines, interpreting it as a signal of regret for not allowing more transparency at the time. Congressional leadership, meanwhile, faced its own dilemma. Some members wanted Crockett censured for her remarks. Others argued that doing so would only elevate her profile and reinforce the perception that she had struck a nerve. Closed-door meetings grew tense, with party strategists weighing the political risks of both action and inaction. Outside government, the legal community was abuzz. Former prosecutors debated whether Crockett's approach could set a precedent for challenging sealed records when they intersect with public trust. Constitutional scholars weighed in on the balance between privacy rights and the public's right to know, with opinion pieces flooding national newspapers. Internationally, the story was reframed as a governance ethics scandal. European and Asian news outlets focused less on the paternity implication and more on the broader allegation of using public resources to shield private matters. Headlines in foreign capitals painted the incident as a warning about the dangers of conflating personal loyalty with state power. Within Trump's political orbit, loyalties began to strain. A handful of prominent allies distanced themselves, issuing carefully worded statements about the need for full transparency without directly criticizing him. Others doubled down, attacking Crockett and accusing the media of amplifying lies. The division wasn't just external, it was creeping inward, threatening to fracture the united front that had been a hallmark of Trump's political brand. By the end of the week, even those who believed the story would eventually fade conceded that its immediate impact was undeniable. Crockett's challenge had forced institutions, from courts to Congress to the media, to confront uncomfortable questions about truth, secrecy, and the line between personal life and public duty. In that sense, the ripples were less like temporary waves and more like a permanent change in the current. The question wasn't whether the moment would be remembered, it was how it would shape the way future confrontations in American politics were fought, and how much silence would still be possible when the documents came out. The cultural aftershock of Crockett's confrontation moved quickly from political circles into everyday life. Within days, the internet had transformed her calm challenge, "Tell me which part is untrue," into a rallying cry. But it was the phrase, "no DNA," that took on a life of its own. Across social media, minimalist posters appeared, stark white background, bold black letters reading simply, "no DNA." They were printed onto t-shirts, plastered onto campus bulletin boards, and even projected onto the sides of buildings in several major cities. On college campuses, student groups organized pop-up debates about the implications of the exchange. Law students argued over the ethics of referencing sealed records in public hearings. Political science clubs dissected the moment as an example of rhetorical precision. Even non-political organizations joined in, hosting civics nights, where clips of the hearing were played before panels of professors, journalists, and community leaders. High school civics teachers began using the exchange as a case study, not because of its scandalous content, but because it illustrated the power of preparation and restraint in public speaking. Lesson plans centered on how Crockett's tone and timing altered the impact of her words, and how the absence of a rebuttal shaped public perception more than any volume could. The conversation about truth versus image intensified nationwide. For years, political debates had often been reduced to partisan sound bites, but Crockett's moment forced people to ask harder questions. Was truth still recognizable without a media filter? Could documentation alone outweigh personality-driven narratives? And if a public figure could not or would not refute a claim, did that silence become part of the truth in the public's mind? Cultural commentators weighed in. Some praised the viral spread as proof that facts still mattered in an age of spin, while others warned that the transformation of a complex legal matter into a meme risked trivializing it. Yet the meme's simplicity was precisely why it stuck. 3 letters repeated twice, carrying an accusation without ever spelling it out. Street artists incorporated the phrase into murals alongside portraits of whistleblowers and reformers. Musicians referenced it in lyrics. Stand-up comedians worked it into routines, noting that no DNA had become the new shorthand for no defense. By the end of the month, the phrase was no longer just about Crockett or Trump Jr. It had become a cultural symbol, invoked in unrelated scandals, sports controversies, and corporate disputes. It was a reminder of the moment when documentation, silence, and public imagination collided to create a lasting imprint on the national consciousness. In political circles, the fallout was immediate and uneven. Several Republican lawmakers who had previously defended Trump Jr. began crafting carefully hedged statements. They avoided repeating his denials outright and instead pivoted to talking points about focusing on the issues that matter to Americans. The absence of strong, unequivocal backing was noticeable. A few high-profile allies went further, distancing themselves entirely. One prominent donor announced that his political contributions would now be directed toward candidates who can represent the party without personal distractions. Another, a former campaign strategist, told a national news outlet that the clip of Trump Jr. sitting silent was political kryptonite in swing districts. Within the GOP, internal polling revealed a troubling trend. Among independents, Crockett's favorability had surged by double digits in just 2 weeks. In districts where races were expected to be competitive, this posed a significant problem. Democratic strategists quickly recognized the opening, crafting ads that replayed the hearing exchange with the tagline, "When the truth comes knocking, some people hide." Crockett's rise in public perception wasn't limited to her own base. Editorial boards in traditionally conservative regions praised her composure and her reliance on documented evidence. Even commentators who disagreed with her politically acknowledged her effectiveness in that moment. The combination of preparedness and restraint had elevated her from a rising figure to a national political force. Internationally, the story shifted in focus. Major newspapers in Europe and Asia moved away from the personal details and reframed the incident as an example of governance ethics. Headlines in London and Berlin described it as a crisis of credibility for a political family long accustomed to controlling its narrative. In Tokyo, one editorial noted that the American public's tolerance for blurred lines between public duty and private interest may be narrowing. Corporate America also took note. A major streaming service fast-tracked a documentary special about the confrontation, interviewing political analysts, legal experts, and cultural critics. Publishers reached out to Crockett's team with book deals focused on leadership, truth-telling, and political accountability. Trump Jr., meanwhile, faced growing difficulties securing certain media appearances. Some networks feared that any live interview would inevitably circle back to the no DNA moment. Event organizers quietly removed him from speaking lineups, citing schedule changes. The industry that had once courted his presence now weighed the risk of being associated with In the end, the political and industry consequences reinforced the cultural impact. Crockett's question hadn't just exposed a vulnerability in her opponent. It had shifted the balance of influence, altered public expectations of political confrontation, and proved that in the right moment, the calm delivery of documented truth could outlast even the loudest denials. The press room was at capacity, cameras lined shoulder to shoulder, lights glaring off polished floors. The murmur of reporters filled the space until the side door opened and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stepped to the podium. She didn't wait for the noise to settle. "Truth doesn't backfire," she began, her voice steady, resonating over the hum of electronics. "It just burns where it needs to." She let the sentence breathe, her gaze moving across the room, making brief contact with lenses and eyes alike. And over the past week, we've all seen exactly where the flames have landed. She placed a thick folder on the podium, its spine worn from handling. The public has a right to clarity. That's why I've taken the necessary steps to unseal the affidavit and all associated evidence from the 2019 Arizona case. A ripple went through the crowd, pens hitting notepads, recorders held higher. This isn't about humiliating anyone, she continued. It's about making sure that when personal actions intersect with public office, there is no confusion about accountability. Documentation matters, records matter. We cannot allow rhetoric, no matter how loud or forceful, to drown out facts that affect governance. She opened the folder just enough to show the edge of the documents inside, then closed it again. These materials will be available to the committee and the press in full. Read them. Study them. Decide for yourselves. That's how a functioning democracy works. A reporter called out, asking whether she feared political retaliation. Crockett didn't hesitate. If telling the truth means retaliation, that says more about our system than it does about me. I'm not here to win a popularity contest. I'm here to make sure the public is informed, fully, and honestly. She shifted her weight, her tone softening but gaining a sharper edge. I've heard the debates. I've seen the memes. I know some people think this is just political theater, but the theater only exists when those in power perform. My role is not to perform, it's to present. What you do with that information is your choice, but the record will remain long after the noise dies down. Pausing, she placed both hands on the podium. So I'm asking every citizen, value documentation over rhetoric, value evidence over applause lines. Hold every one of us to the standard that words alone are not enough, because the truth may be uncomfortable, but it's the only thing that outlasts all of us. She stepped back, slid the folder from the podium, and placed it flat on the table in front of her. Without another word, she turned toward the exit. The sound of cameras clicking followed her out, the flashes catching the steady set of her shoulders. The folder remained where she left it, closed, but now in the public's hands. Its presence a quiet reminder that the fire she spoke of was still burning, and its embers were not going out anytime soon.